to try to finish up in about 30 minutes roughly, and then some minutes for questions. Is that right?
Yes, that would be great.
Yeah. So if you do have one of those burning questions, you will have to unmute yourself in order to ask it. So just, if you haven't used Zoom before, that's something to keep in mind. And then can we get rid of this chat? At least I can get rid of that chat box. Okay. So I've been at Ohio State for about 22 years, worked in Canada as a weed specialist there for 20 years before that. So yes, I am getting long in the tooth and all of the things that go with that. Hopefully I'll get through this presentation today without my voice fading away, which sometimes happens. Usually some people are quite happy about that, actually, when my voice fades away, that is. So yeah, I'm not an organic weed control specialist. I have probably, if I averaged all the time I've spent on organic weed control in the 20 years I've been at Ohio State, it might be 10% averaged across those years. But in recent years, it's been quite a bit more, probably more like 25, 30% of my time has been organic. And then I also work with conventional farmers in fruit and vegetable crops. So actually work with those other techniques for weed control that will almost remain nameless this morning, but probably not quite. Yeah, so you know, the title of the talk is cultural. Cassie, for some reason the poll keeps popping up on my screen. Maybe nobody else is seeing it. Are you guys, does it pop up on everybody's screen or just me? Hello.
On mine, I think you can just push exit. Yeah, and I'm seeing in the chat other people aren't seeing it. So okay. I think if you just click the X and close
well, hopefully, it. Yeah, hopefully it won't keep popping up because it pops up right in the middle of my screen.
That's
so
not
anyway,
good.
We'll work our way through that. So you know, cultural controls are really all of those things that you do that are good farming practices that hopefully help to control weeds, but are kind of indirect in weed control. And when it comes to organic, you're really talking about physical control, so cultivation, tillage, flaming, the use of mulches, etc. So most of our talk today is going to be about physical weed control. And then my slide doesn't want to advance either. Okay, there we go. So first of all, there are no magic, you guys can't see me now. There's no magic bullet when it comes to weed control in organic crops, and there are no easy fixes either. One of the things that we've worked on a lot in the last several years has been the use of soil balancing. And soil balancing is the idea that with a calcium magnesium ratio of about 6:1, that a lot of good things start happening in your soils, one of which is that you have fewer weeds. And our research that has been ongoing for several years now has shown that in many cases we are measuring fewer weeds in gypsum treated plots. In other words, those plots where we've elevated the calcium magnesium ratio to 6:1, and more weeds in Epsom treated plots where we've lowered the calcium magnesium ratio. But the problem is that we're still dealing with very high seed bank densities in both the gypsum treated plots and in the Epsom treated plots. So soil balancing is not an easy fix. It may help to reduce weeds overall, but not something that you're going to be able to get a weed problem under control with. You are looking probably at physical controls and integrated with good cultural practices. And one of those cultural practices that we'll talk a lot about will be kind of bringing land out of production for a period of time and using fallows and using cover crops to get, in particular, to get thistle under control. So cultivation and tillage have one huge problem, actually two problems associated with them that are related to each other. And that problem is the low efficacy of physical control, the low efficacy of tillage and cultivation. Research done at University of Maine by Eric Gallant showed, and this has been corroborated by others too, that typically with cultivation, you get about 70% of the weed seedlings that are growing in a field. Part of that is because weeds are too close to the crop row to uproot them. But the other part of that is just simply that some of those weeds get missed, as even in the center of the row, and they continue to grow. And not only is the efficacy, so not not only is the efficacy relatively low, those plants that continue to grow get bigger and get harder to control the next time that you cultivate. And that's a real problem. So one of the most important things that you can do is to try to reduce the seed bank of your fields. Think about it this way: if you've got a seed bank, or if you've got a seedling population or seedling density in your row crop that you're going to cultivate of 10 seedling weeds per square yard, and you have an efficacy of 70% from your first cultivation, that means that you're going to have about 3 seedlings that will survive that first cultivation, 3 seedlings in every square yard. Now, 3 seedlings per square yard would be a relatively easy job to go back and get the rest of those 3 per square yard. If you have 100, or worst case, you have 1,000, and we do have communities that have 1,000 seedlings per square yard. That's really, really high. But in that case, 70% efficacy would mean that you would have 300 seedlings still remaining after you cultivate it. Now, you're not going to go back in and hand weed out 300 seedlings per square meter. So per square yard. So the first thing that you want to try to do, or one of your main focuses, needs to be in trying to get that population down, the density of the seeds in the soil weed seed bank down. And keep in mind too that cultivation is the efficacy of cultivation is very size dependent. We generally say that you should cultivate at the the thread stage, the white thread stage, to about the cotyledon stage if you want your cultivation to be really effective. However, the cotyledon stage can really vary in terms of size depending on the species. So this is one of Eric's photos, but on the right-hand side, you've got a seedling of pigweed and you've got a lamb's quarter seedling. Very light cultivation is going to control those. Crabgrass at the 1 leaf stage, you're going to get great control with it. But some other species, hemp nettle on the far left and mustard in the middle there, much larger. These have got root systems and hypocotyls that are probably 2 inches long, at least at the cotyledon stage. So it's going to take much more aggressive cultivation to get those out. And one of the approaches that can be used, and Eric has shown this in his research, is to stack cultivation equipment. And we'll look at that a little bit more closely in a second. Okay, so actually we're going to look at it right now. So by stacking, we just simply mean you have more than one tool on the toolbar. And this is, right now we're going to look at a short video by Tillmore out of Orville, Ohio, who's building, small farm appropriate tractors and implements. And here they're going to have some V-shaped and Y-shaped shanks that you're looking at right now. That will cut right up to the row and then take weeds out in the middle of the row. And then here we're going to also see that that's ganged together. Come on. Well, I said that's okay, here we go. So those shanks are ganged together with finger weeders that go in and help to take some of the small seedlings out that are right in around the corn plants. Now notice that this soil is really cloddy. Let's look at that again. And this, you're never going to get really outstanding weed control when you've got a cloddy soil like this. So one of the things that you want to do if you're going to be depending on tillage is you want to try to improve that soil quality and get a more friable, a better tilth to your soil so that you don't have those clumps where seedlings can germinate within them and then survive. So soil quality is usually important. One of the ways to improve your soil quality and to reduce the problem that you're going to have with weeds over the long term is by having a good crop rotation. So here we're looking at some old research from the 1990s, looking at kind of the interactions between crop rotations and herbicide use. And we have on the left axis, we've got giant foxtail plants per square meter. So say per square yard, from 0 up to 1,600 foxtail per square yard. And then on the horizontal axis, we've got the effect with continuous corn year after year, a soybean corn rotation, and then a soybean wheat corn rotation. And so regardless of whether you had low efficacy herbicides or high efficacy herbicides, you have much fewer seedlings in those plots when you've got that that soybean, wheat, corn rotation. And that's especially because you've got different planting times, and that wheat really changes things because you're planting it towards the end of the summer into the fall. So same principle is going to apply if you're using tillage and cultivation only for weed control. That rotation is going to make a difference. And just thinking of giant ragweed, which we're really not going to talk about this morning, but some modeling research out of Iowa State has shown that if you could extend that out to a 5-year rotation, you're going to have much better success at handling giant ragweed than you would have with just a 3-year rotation, which is much more standard. So if that's a weed that you're battling with, that's something to keep in mind. And we may have another session talking about giant ragweed. But because of the low efficacy of tillage, of cultivation, and because of the density independent aspect of cultivation, one of the most important things, if you really want to be successful, you've got to reduce the return of seeds to the weed seed bank every year. So that needs to be a major focus. So this is a field just north of Worcester, switching to Canada Thistle now. And this picture, besides being a really pretty picture, I think it says some things about Canada Thistle. It says some things about life in general. One of those things being that if you do something and you find that it doesn't work, maybe you should stop doing it and try something else. And believe it or not, I'm almost certain that this field is a no-till corn soybean field, corn soybean only, and it has been sprayed with Roundup every year for the last roughly 20 years. And so Roundup can be used. Glyphosate can be very effective in reducing the problem from Canada Thistle, but not in a no-till situation, and not when that's the only thing that you're doing. So there's also some real vulnerabilities that Canada Thistle has, though, that if you pay attention to, if you learn about those vulnerabilities and then kind of pay attention to them and how you would exploit those vulnerabilities in your own fields, you can really make a difference. Now, if you've got a Canada Thistle situation like this, don't plant vegetables, and really don't plant organic corn and soybeans, at least in 2021. You're going to want to take that ground out of production, because you are going to have a nightmare wherever your field is located. We'll get to that here in a moment, but I hate these kind of slides. I'm just going to get all the way down through the things I want to show. Approaches to Canada Thistle control that actually make a difference, that actually work if you keep thinking about them and keep practicing the application of them. Limiting seed dispersal. Hugely important. Even if there's only a few seeds, every seed that germinates in the soil starts a new thistle plant. So you want to mow infested areas, even if they're kind of outside of your crop, or even an area in your crop that you weren't able to get it controlled. Just don't let it go to seed. And of course, grow competitive crops, because if you're growing competitive crops, you'll get less seed production. Now, when it comes to the seedlings of Canada Thistle, they don't start to produce perennial root until, in some estimates, as much as 6 to 8 weeks after establishment. But certainly, if you can cultivate those seedlings out within the first month, you're probably going to get really excellent control of thistle seedlings. And secondly, prevent root fragment dispersal. So there are times when you really need to kind of implement your long-term control tactic for thistle, that you need to cut that root system up. You need to use rolling discs of some sort that will sever those root systems, sever them deeply, because you want the dormancy to, you want those rhizomes to come out of dormancy and grow, so that you have a chance to use your physical control on them. But don't cut them up and then drag them around your field with an S-tine or a spring-tooth harrow. And of course, that could be part of what we saw in Friendsville Road, that it also did get dragged around the field at some point. One of the both easiest and hardest things that a farmer has to do is to clean equipment. between fields. But if you got a field that's infested with thistle or with some other weed that's in that field, but you don't have in other fields, one of the easiest things you can do is to clean that equipment before you move it. But it's also one of the hardest things because you have to think about it. You got to stop what you're doing and you got to clean it. So root extraction, which sounds like a trip to the dentist, but is just the way the Europeans talk about dragging, and they've done more work on this than anybody else has, dragging thistle and other perennial weed rhizomes and root systems to the surface and letting them dry out. And then where we're going to spend most of our time today is talking about degrading root reserves through mowing, through the use of competitive perennial and biennial crops, and especially about the use of competitive annual crops. So this kind of complicated slide is actually a really great illustration of Canada thistle biology and how to exploit the plant's biology in such a way so that you can maximize the efficacy of your control practices. So I think you can see my mouse moving around here, my cursor. Here you've got root reserves in levels. So this is food that the thistle plant is storing in its root system, from very little to a lot of root reserves. This is sugar and carbohydrates that it uses in the spring to feed new growth. So looking over here, over the growing season and over the whole year, actually, we see that by the end of the summer, as it gets into the fall, that the thistle plant has kind of stored a lot of fat, we might say. You know, if it was me, it would be, I've stored a lot of fat. Well, the thistle plant has kind of stored a lot of fat, a lot of reserves in that root system. And those roots are ready to feed new growth in the spring. And you want to avoid this if you possibly can. You don't want this to happen. But in order to not have this happen, you've got to be doing something back here and here when those root reserves are at their lowest possible stage. So for me, after I've been cycling all summer, I'm usually down about 5 to 10 pounds. So this is the time to hit me and go after me right here, you know, when I've lost my belly. So just like that with the thistle plant. And you've got two times, with right around the bloom stage being the time when the roots are most maximally depleted. So that bloom stage is hugely important. But there's earlier times in the growing season, earlier in the spring, when they're also relatively low. And that time coincides with about the time that new thistle shoots have got somewhere between 4 and about 8 or 6 and 10 new leaves on them, are about 7 to 10 inches tall on average. And that's going to vary a little bit from one field to another, from one clone of thistle to another clone of thistle, because when you see those patches, they're not necessarily all the same plant. So these are the times to go after thistle. Okay, now I talked about the root extraction, and just a real quick word on this. A lot of work has been done in the Netherlands, and they have shown that in those really bad infested fields, that if you're willing to, if you don't want to grow anything in that field, which I probably wouldn't recommend. I'd recommend using a cover crop, but if for some reason you don't want to do that and you're organic, you can go after thistle with various types of implements that drag the rhizomes, the root system, to the surface and let them desiccate and dry out. And somewhere in the range of 7, you know, in their research, 7, 8 times doing this over the course of like April through early August, was as effective in getting rid of thistle as using Roundup was, using glyphosate was. We've used one of these, the rod weeder at OERDC, which is actually this one up here. And the thing that's nice about this can work very well, and it's cheap. And it's just a simple rod with sort of cylinder sleeves around it here, here, and here that allow that rod to actually rotate and move. You can buy one of these. There's companies that manufacture them for under $1,000, or if you're a good welder, you could make your own. The thing is that to get in and use this before those thistle shoots get more than about 9, 10 inches tall before they get more than 7 or 8 new leaves on them. So when you see them reaching that growth stage, that's the time that you want to get in there, not later than those times. So you just do that every time it reaches that stage, you do it over and over again. So I think a better approach is to use cover crops. And this is, again, if you've got a really heavy infestation that you're trying to get rid of. If you're growing forages, this is a great approach that you can use very effectively, because alfalfa and thick alfalfa, thick clover stands are super competitive with thistle. And on their own will reduce the thistle to some extent, but when you combine it with timely mowing, you can really, really reduce the thistle. So this broken line is showing Canada thistle biomass reduction. In this case, this is the clover, white clover grass stand, going from nearly 200 grams per square meter down to just over 50 with just 6 mowings of that crop. So that might be 6 mowings of alfalfa, might be a little high for Ohio, but you could get close to that over a single growing season. Up here, we're looking at the same mowing treatments in stubble. So this was without a crop growing in the field. And it also works if you get in there and mow it. It just doesn't work as well as when you have the competitive perennial or biennial crop, forage crop growing with it. So for a forage producer, if you mow, and in this case, the mowing wants to take place before the thistle, around the time thistle gets to that bud stage, because remember, the bud early bloom stage is when you've depleted that rhizome to the maximum amount. If you let it grow beyond that and don't mow, you're going to replenish the root system and you're going to be starting all over again. So I want to talk about competition with annual crops, which I think has much greater applicability to row crop farmers who don't have forages in the rotation. We're going to look at some different things that have been used. Traditionally, buckwheat has been used for a cover crop to suppress and smother out thistle more than any other. But what we learned about it is that buckwheat doesn't actually work nearly as well as cover crops that are based on Sudan grass or sorghum Sudan grass. Now, this does require taking your field out of production. And this is some research done in Illinois by Abram Bixler and John Mazunas back about 10, 12 years ago. And for this study, they had 2 sites. They went in and they spring tilled the field. They let the thistle come up, and then they tilled it. So you can see before they tilled it, their thistle density in shoots per square yard or whatever was up here at about 100. So they had very high densities of thistle. The tillage alone knocks that tillage when those shoots were 6, 8 inches tall, because it hits them when they were at that compensation point, just at the compensation point, knocks the density way down by itself. So 3 months out, 12 months out, 15 months out from when that first tillage takes place, we see we've got a whole lot less thistle shoots in the field. But what gets really interesting is when you look at the comparison between buckwheat and Sudan grass and the mix. So this is buckwheat, this is the fallow here, this is the buckwheat, and then here, these 2 bars are the Sudan grass, this one's Sudan grass here, and then this is a mix of Sudan grass with cowpea. And these measurements are taken at 3 months, 12 months, and 15 months after these crops were growing for pretty much the full season, with or without mowing. And so you see that the mix and the Sudan grass have just decimated that thistle stand. See how low they are compared. And here's the thing, 15 months out, you are still seeing, and this is now in a successive soybean crop planted the following year, you've still got less thistle in the Sudan grass plots than you have in the fallow. So let's take a look at the second site. We see pretty much the same effect. This is just a different site. We see there was a higher, more established stand of thistle at this site than there was at the previous site. The tillage operation doesn't knock it back nearly as much as it did at, here's the density before tillage and before they planted the cover crops. The tillage doesn't knock it back as much as it did at the previous site. But look at what your sorghum, your Sudan grass and your Sudan grass cowpea mix are doing at 3 months, at 12 months, and again, even at 15 months out after those plots, those cover crops had been planted. And of course, by the time you're out into that second growing season, those cover crops have been terminated, they've been plowed under. That site has actually been fall plowed as well as spring plowed again, and then planted to soybeans. So I wanted to throw this slide in though to show you that just looking at the densities doesn't tell you everything, or looking at the stands doesn't tell you everything that's going on here. This is looking at thistle shoot biomass. And when you get out here and look at the biomass of the shoots that are coming up at 15 months out, what you start to see is that the size of the shoots, they're getting bigger, they're getting heavier. So the thistle is starting to recover in the soybean plot. Now, what this is telling you is that you can't just do one thing and get thistle under control. So you do all of this stuff to knock those huge patches back that you had in your nightmare, and then you plant the soybeans the following year, but you still have to be very aggressive in going after thistle if you don't want them to start recovering. And this is often what happens. We really go after it one year and then we have a lot of success, so we take it easy, but you can't take it easy with thistle. So here we're looking just at the effect of mowing in those same plots. So there was, the cover crops were planted in half of the plot, in the full plot, half of the plot was mowed either not at all or one time or two times. And so what we're seeing here is that mowing two times during the cover crop establishment. So this is kind of analogous to the alfalfa field now, or the clover field, where you're mowing and harvesting and removing it, except they left they let the cover crops fall to the ground and continue to smother. Now, the important difference, and I'm glad I almost didn't mention this, the important difference between buckwheat and mixes that contain Sedan grass or sorghum Sedan grass in particular is that sorghum and sorghum Sedan grass regrows quickly after you mow it. Buckwheat does not regrow at all. And it's that regrowth of the sorghum and the Sudan grass, just like your alfalfa field or your clover field is going to regrow quickly after you mow it. That's what makes the difference in having real suppression and real control over the long term. Cassie, how are we doing on time?
You're at about at 30 minutes, so maybe you can wrap up here quick. And
yeah, I think I'll do that. I have one more slide that I think I won't bother showing. Let me just say, this is work done by John Cardina and by Stephanie Wedrick at OERDC back about 10 years ago. And they looked at sorghum Sudan grass, which is just a hybrid of sorghum and Sudan. And they also had some sunflowers in there or something too. They compared it to a cool season mix of oat and mustard. And then they compared it to another mix containing a grass called teff, which is another warm season grass. What I want you to take a note of here is, I mean, first of all, when it comes to percent cover and biomass, that the sorghum Sudan grass is always the lowest, okay? Biomass of 1.8 compared to 14 and 19 and 18, percent cover of 12 and 0.42 compared to much higher levels of percent cover of the plot. But the big difference is the timing of when they seeded. They seeded in early May. They put out a set of plots in early May. They put out another set of plots in late May, and then they put out a third set of plots in middle of June. And the reduction of thistle was much, much greater with those middle and particularly with those late plantings of all of the cover crops than it was with the early ones. And the reason for that is because these late plantings coincided much better with when those root systems of the thistle plants were depleted. So kind of just remember, when you're dealing with thistle, you're not necessarily dealing with the same plant, the same genotype across your field. So you may find, in fact, you're likely to find that there's going to be some variability in how your controls work. And in fact, remember, you are in the thick of variability when you're doing physical weed control in organic systems, because everything is variable. The weather's variable, the soil's variable, your field's variable, on and on and on. Control requires multiple tactics, timed correctly over multiple years. So you gotta be thinking probably, I would say, 3 years at least to really get a severe problem under control. If you've got low density infestations, mowing your pastures during the bud to early bloom stage should be highly effective. And in row crops, I mean, basically you want to remove those individual shoots, low density, a thistle shoot coming up here, another one somewhere else, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. Tillage after thistle emergence, using and then for cultivation, using duck feet, sweeps that will cut them off, okay? And then the ones that you don't get, you're gonna have to go back in and home out, pull them out. For the heavy infestations, you want to use tillage after thistle emergence to fragment the roots, and then you want to delay that seeding of your cover crop. Don't plant as soon as you can get on the ground. Wait until, delay your planting until they've come up a bit, till them under, and then plant at least the middle of May, the end of May, if not the middle of June. Sudan grass or sorghum Sudan grass seem to be working well for us. And then use mowing. If you see thistle coming up in the sorghum Sudan grass, mow it at about the early bloom stage. Terminate it with fall tillage. Don't disperse it across the field by dragging an S-tine through it. Come back in the spring, till again when the thistle's up. Don't try to make this, maybe not the year to try to get in as early as possible. Let the tillage emerge, let the thistle emerge, get 6-7 inches tall, cut it off, plant your competitive crop, and then cultivate in it and repeat as needed. So that's it. And we do have a few minutes for questions if there are any.
Feel free to put a question in the chat box, or go ahead and unmute and ask. We're a small group. Doug, I had a question on controlling thistle after the initial, or like right around the bud stage. At what point do those seeds become viable and you have to worry about that?
I think that's a really good point, and I don't know the absolute answer to that. I think thistle requires cross-pollination between the plants. Some of the plants are I believe it's dioecious, and I should know this absolutely. I'm pretty sure, but not positive. And I think dioecious means that you have male flowers and you have female flowers. So I'm going to assume from that those flower buds actually have to open up for pollination to occur. So prior to the time that you can see the purple parts of the flowers sticking out, I think you're pretty safe. And there are some other people on the call who may be able to say if I've got that all wrong or not. I know Kathy's here, and I always respect her opinions on things. So Kathy, if I'm wrong, this is the time to say it again. Yeah, so I think
You're good.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. The check will be in the mail later, okay? Yeah, so up to that bud stage, definitely, I think you're safe. And that's actually when you want to do it, bud to very, very early bloom, okay? Great question, though, Cassie. I'm glad you asked it.
Doug, can you talk a little bit about how a cover crop might be helpful or not when you're controlling an annual crop or an annual weed, like maybe ragweed or something, or foxtail?
Well, I think that, in Ohio and in the Midwest, and generally, certainly Eastern Midwest, we have a lot of soils that are not in the greatest of shape, and it's aggravated by when you get wet springs and you're trying to do some tillage and sometimes cultivation when you shouldn't be. I mean, ideally you wouldn't be. You'd have drier soils, and that contributes to clumping. So, but if we can get our organic matter levels up, that's definitely going to improve soil tilth over time. And This may be a place also where the soil balancing approach can make a difference. We've done a lot of research over many years, and we have not been successful in showing improvements in soil physical qualities, in soils, in silt loams that we have balanced. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. We just weren't successful. However, at our 2 research sites, we had one here in Worcester, we had another one over near Bowling Green. At Bowling Green, we had a lot fewer weeds in our soil balance plots than we did at Worcester. And it is a fact that the tilth of that soil over at Bowling Green, once it gets dried out, that's the critical thing, because when it's wet, it's gunk. But once it's dried out, it actually has surprisingly good tilth. So that corroborates that. And, you know, you can't get good weed control in a clumpy soil. And then so the cover crops are going to help with tilth, I think, over time. I think that's a general consensus. And so cover crops can be really helpful in any time that you can get them in and get them established. But a lot of people say, well, I tried cover crops and they didn't work. They didn't suppress my weeds. But that is almost always related to a poor stand of the cover crop. There's no sense having a cover crop that doesn't have a good establishment. You need a thick, dense stand without gaps in it if you want cover crops to work. So that's kind of a roundabout answer, and it's an incomplete answer.
I'll take it.
Yeah, there's got to be, you know, some people out there maybe with some problems that we haven't talked about at all. Heard people talking about Pennsylvania smartweed. What were some of the other ones?
Oh, a lot of ragweed, quackgrass, giant ragweed, foxtail.
So when it comes to quackgrass, what's going to work for thistle probably is going to work for quackgrass, and for other perennials, it's going to be helpful. When it comes to ragweed, Pennsylvania smartweed has mostly been a fairly periodic emerger. Tends to come up early, although we've got some up in the Celeryville area that seems to germinate all summer now. And that's kind of a common thing that we see happen as a species becomes more and more problematic. That's particularly, so that may be happening with Pennsylvania smartweed. If you've got a species that's periodic, that sort of has a peak to its, you know, like it germinates, Pennsylvania smartweed that we had here in Worcester would tend to germinate between about the end of April and the latter part of May. So if you could delay planting a vegetable crop, let's say, until after the end of May, you could escape a lot of the problem that you would have with Pennsylvania smartweed. You wouldn't just want to let it grow and go to seed, but you could do some light stale seed bed operations before planting your crop, and you would have knocked a lot of Pennsylvania smartweed out of the soil. And delayed planting is a good tactic for certain types of weeds. Barnyard grass tends to germinate pretty early. So if you've got a heavy barnyard grass infestation, you could delay planting for a few weeks and really avoid a lot of it. You know, giant ragweed is just a huge problem for the people who have it. And giant ragweed seems to have gone through kind of a shift in its biology from where it germinated mostly in sort of late April and May to where, I mean, actually the last few years it's germinating the middle of March and continues at our Worcester site. It's germinating through until the end of August. And so there is a clue there for the person who doesn't have a giant ragweed problem, though. And that clue is that, you know, don't let it go to seed, number one, and be particularly vigilant about giant ragweed seedlings that emerge late in the growing season. Like, because those ones could be representing that shift in biology, and that's a shift in biology that makes control much, much more difficult because you have to use control for a much longer period of time. Hopefully that makes sense. Did it make sense to you, Cassie?
Yep. We do have a question about allelopathy, and particularly with fennel seed, if that is effective against annual weeds, or if it could be sown among perennials to kind of help stunt weed growth.
So was the comment about fennel?
Yes, allelopathic properties of fennel seed. So, and Not sure about that. You could maybe talk about allelopathy in general.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, fennel is a very aromatic plant, and there seems to be an association between that property of being aromatic and being having some allelopathic characteristics. Um, you know, what I would say about allelopathy is it probably falls into that same category as I'm beginning to think soil balancing does. It can probably help, but it's not going to control your weeds for you. So again, unfortunately, allelopathy is unlikely to be a quick fix for anybody, or an easy fix. And I don't know about fennel specifically, but certainly in the case of using winter rye, and also there's some evidence that sorghum and possibly Sedan grass and their hybrids also have some allelopathic characteristics that, in combination with the competition and in combination when you mow them down and use them as kind of a mulch, may contribute to some of the weed control that they most definitely can provide. The problem with all of these methods really that we use in organic agriculture is that they're very environmentally sensitive, and they're very highly variable in how they are going to work in a given year, dependent upon all of the other environmental factors that are kind of interacting within the field.
Thanks, Doug. Any other questions out there? Pause for a minute. See if anyone wants to ask anything. Hearing none.
I would,
Unless you have something else to, oh, wait, John, did you have a question?
yes. When a seed bank is smothered so that the seed doesn't germinate or appear to come up like clover, does that seed survive to the following year?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think there might be, more than one aspect to what you're asking there, but there's a common perception out there that weed seeds last in the soil for a long time, like for multiple years. And the probably what's closer to the truth is that a very tiny number of the seeds of any given species will survive for a relatively long period of time. So you might have like 0.1% of the seeds of a species that fell to the soil last fall, that in 5 years or even 10 years might still be in the soil in that same field from 2020. But 99, maybe even 99.9% of those seeds are going to have died a natural death over 3 or 4 or 5 years. So even by doing nothing, a lot of those seeds will disappear. And then if you can stimulate those seeds to germinate and emerge, and then kill them by using light tillage, just very light tillage at the seedling stage, you can really knock those seeds that were established, that were deposited last fall, you can knock their numbers down pretty quickly. It's basically the stale seedbed approach. 5 or 6 weeks of that from late April through the 1st of June can really have quite an impact on the number of weeds that you'll have to control with cultivation after you've established the crop. So John, does that get at your question?
Well, does the seed bank get reduced by smothering the seeds from coming up?
Well,
do those seeds, do they start to grow and then die?
okay, so that's helpful what you just said. Let me give you the example of when you're using, if you're a vegetable grower and you're using plastic or any kind of mulch, seeds do germinate underneath that, particularly under plastic, because that's been looked at a number of times. You get a lot of germination under plastic. And of course, those seeds germinate and they don't go to seed. And I think under organic mulches, it probably occurs as well, although the environment is a little bit different. Is it as effective as doing a stale seed bed on bare ground where you can cultivate every 10, 15 days, do some light tillage every 10 to 15 days, which knocks out the seedlings that have come up and then stimulates still more seeds to germinate and emerge? Do it again, another 2 weeks. Probably not as effective as that, but yes, they do germinate and they do get smothered out underneath the mulch.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions out there? We're a little, well, we're actually right around the time that we're going to quit, but Doug, can you unshare your screen?
I hope so.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. We are not going to have a webinar next week because of the OFA conference, and hopefully you're familiar with the OFA conference. I will be there. We'll have a booth and a couple special guests. But if you need, trying to get to the right slide, there it is. So if you want more information about the conference, you can go to ofa.org and check that out. They have a lot of great presentations coming up. But we'll be back on the 17th with a presentation on high tunnel production with Matt Klein-Hintz, and we'll look forward to that. And thank you all for joining us. And if you think of another question, you can send it my way and we'll try to get that answered for you. But thanks for joining us, everyone, and hope you have a great week.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Put my email in the chat there. All right, I'm going to stop recording before I forget.